Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening, wherever you might happen to be. Welcome to today's very special and billed as the final in the current configuration of the Russia Public Policy Series. My name's Alex Cooley, member of the faculty at the Harriman Institute and co-chair of this wonderful institution with Josh Tucker, who's the director of the Jordan Center here at NYU. Uh, we are investigating a topic that we thought really speaks to the purpose of the series that we set up 9 years ago now. And we have investigated a number of current Russia-related policy topics, including of late of the last 3 years, its war in Ukraine, also questions of its public health involving COVID, U.S. Russia relations, a whole myriad of different topics. And the purpose is to bring together different sort of experts with different types of professional expertise and knowledge on Russia. This time around, we have four academic experts who also are distinguished public commentators on Russia and especially U.S. Russia relations. So we're giving it an academic tinge, but it's actually a public profile, a set of speakers who all have distinguished public profiles. I want to say a special thanks to the Jordan Center for hosting us today. I want to say also extend my thanks to Josh for being such a great partner on this series for the last 9 years. And also a big thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has generously sponsored this through a grant at the Harriman Institute at Columbia. So today is a mixed format event. We have a live panel here that you can see. Also, we are coming to you in hybrid over Zoom. We are going to entertain questions both from the audience and over Zoom. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in. Are we using, is it the chat that we're using? The Q&A in the Zoom. So please feel free to do that and we'll alternate amongst them. So again, welcome. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here at this event. And looking forward to your comments on 10 years of observing U.S. Russia relations. And I'll turn it over to Josh, who will introduce them and moderate the session.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So first of all, I want to thank everybody, all of you who've come and joined us here today. A little bit of the history of the New York City Russia Public Policy Series. It's kind of crazy because when Alex and I first had this idea to do this, that I don't know, either of us thought we would be doing this 9 years later, but we originally envisioned it as something that would have 2 events per semester, one at NYU, one at Columbia, and then there'd be a dinner afterwards, and they'd be kind of biggish events. And then the pandemic hit, and the pandemic hit, and we moved online. And in those early days of the pandemic, if you remember correctly, when everybody was stuck at home, online seemed like a good place to be. And it was a good place to connect with people. And also the summer wasn't any different than the spring. And so we started doing them every month during that time online. And when we came back out of the pandemic, as people gradually returned to all sorts of in-person activities, we kept them online. And part of the reason we kept them online is because more people were able to join online, more people, bigger community. It also made it a lot easier for us to get participants. We could reach out to participants a week, 2 weeks beforehand with an idea for a topic, and people only had to join online. But as we headed into the end of, and again, I do want to stress this phase of the New York City Russia Public Policy Series, which is the New York City Russia Public Policy Series sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation. We did want to do one last in-person event as our final event in conjunction with the conference going on at Columbia tomorrow for the 10th anniversary of the Carnegie Fellowship. So it is a great pleasure to see all of you here joining us in person. It's also an amazing pleasure to see everybody joining us on Zoom. And it is people who have joined us on Zoom who have sustained this project and have sustained this and have made it such a sort of vibrant forum over the years for talking about so many different topics and bringing in, as Alex said, combinations of academics and practitioners to talk about all sorts of different topics of great interest. So I want to give a special thanks to the people on Zoom who are still joining us here today. I think it's very appropriate. I will note that on Zoom, we have at least one former panelist from the New York City Public Policy. So a huge shout out to Catherine Stoner, who's joining us, who's been on the other side of this before. And I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention also joining us, our longtime attendee since we went on Zoom, my mom, who's there. So a huge shout out to my mom, and thank you for joining us on Zoom. And of course, an incredible thanks to Alex for being such an amazing partner throughout the years of running this. Also, thanks to Tim Frye, Elise Giuliano, who have also helped run it in the years since Alex has taken a step back. It's been incredible. And I also want to give a great thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York and close with one little anecdote, which is about 10 years ago, and you'll hear everyone who's going to Columbia will hear much more about this tomorrow. The Carnegie Corporation of New York announced, I think in part in response to an op-ed by Mike McFall saying we didn't have enough, we were losing our edge in terms of Russia experience and Russia scholarship in the United States, that it would have this competition for money to go to universities to improve training around Russia. NYU, I was not the director of the Jordan Center at the time. NYU made the decision it did not apply for that money, but Columbia did apply for that money. And Alex said afterwards, part of our proposal was trying to increase ties regionally around other universities. And so I heard this as, when I became director of the Jordan Center, an invitation to help them spend the money that they had gotten from the Carnegie Corporation, which I have tried to the best of my ability to do for the past 9 years. Tim and I did some other things with it as well. But it has been just an absolute pleasure. And none of this actually would have happened without the Carnegie Corporation. We would have continued doing things at the Jordan Center, as NYU, and as Columbia and Harriman. And I think it's been incredibly valuable to me. I'd like to think had an incredibly valuable impact among all the many people who served as panelists on this, which I would add includes Evan Gershkovich, who was on one of our panels earlier as well. So there have been lots of people who've been panelists, tons of people who've been in the audience. And it is a credit to Carnegie for making this decision 10 years ago to put money into this field that this kind of came out of it. So those are my big thanks to everybody as the last New York City Russia Public Policy Series sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation. Just to go over the logistics, each of our speakers will speak on the topic that Alex announced for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. I'll introduce each of them in turn. We're going to go in alphabetical order and as they're listed on the program. And then we will move to the question and answer. And as Alex said, we're going to try to incorporate question and answer both from the Zoom audience. So you guys should put your questions in Q&A. You can do that at any time. We won't ask them until afterwards. And Alex and I will pose those questions, as those of you who join us online for the last 5 years know there's the normal plan. And we'll also alternate with the people in the audience here. So we'll go back and forth. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to pass the baton to Tim Frye from Columbia University.
Thank you very much, Josh. I would be remiss if you allow me one more thanks to these two guys, to Alex and Josh, for all that they've done. I mean, I think they really deserve a round of applause. And the Carnegie Corporation grants not just for the Russian Public Policy Series, it's also done a lot for postdoctoral fellowships, dissertation research, travel money. It's really been a godsend, and I think it's just launched a lot of careers and been really a terrific thing. That's not what I was asked to speak about. My marching orders were to discuss the kind of main drivers of U.S.-Russian relations over the last decade. Also to discuss how commenting on U.S.-Russian relations have changed over the last decade, and to speculate a little bit about the future. And to organize my answers, I think it's helpful to focus on a single concept, which is autocratization, which is just the concentration of power in the hands of the executive and the erosion of constraints on that power. And I think this trend has had big implications for all three topics: for policy, for how we comment on U.S.-Russian relations, and also on future developments. Now, I think we see this autocratization happening in both countries. Not saying that Russia and the United States are similar political systems. They're starting from very different points, very different levels of concentration of authority. But in both countries, we see policy, particularly now, largely being made by a single individual without the kinds of constraints that we've seen under past administrations, particularly in the United States, but also in Russia. Now, we know that leaders play an outside role in foreign policy. Often parliaments and Congress are happy to delegate to the executive branch. They often have more expertise and more resources to develop particular policies. Also, when hard decisions are to be made, Congress is often willing to delegate those hard decisions to the executive, but that's not really what we see here. I think in both cases, we see the autocrat reaching out, or the executive reaching out and taking power into their own hands. So what has been the impact of this on the substance of policy? Well, it's interesting to think about sanctions policy over the first Trump administration, where the Trump administration largely followed Congress's lead and did a lot of things that Congress wanted, even things that Donald Trump was not particularly happy about. We go to the Biden administration, and Biden was unable to do a lot of things that he wanted to do with sanctions and with aid to Ukraine, precisely because Congress had another set of preferences. We don't see Congress as a huge roadblock on executive decision-making at the moment. Perhaps an understatement. Policy has become much more personalized. Personal goals of the executive are often quite different from national goals. If we look at, for example, the Alaska summit, this was something that had benefits for Donald Trump as an executive. He certainly likes the attention of holding these kinds of executive summits. It distracts from other issues that might be more damaging to the presidency, such as the Epstein files and others. It also helps in his quixotic quest for the Nobel Prize. But we didn't hear, I didn't at least, a thoughtful, coherent, laid out plan of how this was the interest in the United States. Right? This is one of the things we see, is that policy is often made based on the kind of personal preferences of the autocrat without some kind of broader rationale for how this serves the national interests. We look at Russia, we also see the increasing concentration of power in the hands of the executive from 2016 until today. We see this kind of descent from being a kind of competitive authoritarian regime to a fully consolidated personalist autocracy. And, you know, if we look at the decision to launch the full scale of invasion, I think a lot of the blame goes to the personal preferences of Vladimir Putin. As part of the Russian election study with Bryn Rosenfeld and John Reuter and Henry Hale, we had a survey in the field in December of 2021 where we asked, you know, what should Russia do about the war in Ukraine? And we actually used the word war at the time. And so this is 2 months before the war began, and we gave several options, and only 8% of Russians chose send Russian troops in. 9% said that we should send arms to the groups in eastern Ukraine that are fighting Kiev. About a third said moral support, a third said kind of humanitarian support, and about a third, without being prompted, said we should just stay out. Right? So it's not the case that I think this decision was a bottom-up decision that was foisted upon the executive branch. And if we look at the reaction of the business elite to Putin's announcing the decision on television on the eve of the invasion, when he had gathered all the business leaders around them, I think their faces revealed a lot more fear than support. So autocratization in both countries has made politics a lot more opaque, a lot more unpredictable. It's also made life really difficult for the allies, right? If you look at the Europeans and the Ukrainians trying to figure out, you know, what is U.S. policy? They have a huge stake in figuring this out, more than we certainly have, and they seem to be really at sea. So beyond the substantive effect on policy, autocratization also makes it harder for commenting on Russia. Demand for expertise is way down. I think that's one way of putting it. I find it personally a lot harder to gin up the energy to write an op-ed, knowing that will have little effect. Now, the probability of an op-ed ever having an impact is never very good, but now it's even lower. It's gone from slim to none. But more generally, the kind of evidence-based commenting that is the comparative advantage of academics is just simply no longer in vogue in the political sphere or in the journalistic sphere. There was a moment from 2016 to 2020 when there was this, monkey cage. Vox News was all about evidence-based journalism, using academic expertise to inform public debate, but that seems to have really gone out of fashion. Also, because regimes have become much more autocratic, it's become much more difficult for us to comment on them, in part because they're much more arbitrary and unpredictable. This is not a bug of the system, it's a feature. This is something that autocrats like. They like to be seen as having arbitrary power and being unpredictable. Now, our job as academics is to come up with general theories that make precise predictions about how these autocracies are going to behave. The arbitrariness and the unpredictability not only frustrates foreign investors who would like to invest in the country, or elites who are trying to manage their assets in Russia, it also makes it a lot more difficult for us. And just the access to information and the kinds of research that we could do when we had the opportunity to really work very closely with Russian colleagues on the ground has really hindered our ability to supply the kinds of commentary on U.S.-Russian relations. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to Putinology and just try to put Putin on the couch and try to understand U.S.-Russia relations in this way, or to resort to cultural stereotypes, or to just kind of reach into the grab bag of history and look for some analogies. But I do think our ability to provide the kinds of good social science-based commentary on U.S.-Russian relations has suffered. Okay. Now, it's not impossible to do, though. I mean, I've still been impressed. There was a paper by Alexei Makadin on the impact of trade sanctions on Russia that he presented at Columbia last week. And he'd collected a massive amount of data from Russian customs, from the UN, from Russia's trading partners. And he and his team were able to make a rather precise estimate of the impact of trade sanctions on the imports of sanctioned firms. They estimate that about a 60% drop in imports and about a 15% drop in revenue of firms that were subject to trade sanctions, so a specific kind of trade sanctions. Now, the Russian government apparently has figured out that one could back out this kind of analysis, and now they're only reporting the trade statistics in a much broader and coarser set of categories, so it's much more difficult to figure out the trade patterns of sanctioned and unsanctioned firms. So that's a kind of good example. It's still possible to do public opinion research in Russia, but you have to do a lot more to kind of validate that people aren't afraid or dissembling in their responses. So in a sense, it's more important than ever to provide this kind of evidence-based commentary, but it is much more difficult. Okay, let me just wrap up with some speculation about the future. Autocratization here, I think, is really important because if you think about like the structural conditions for Russia's future, in some ways they look pretty good, right? GDP per capita, levels of education, levels of ethnic and religious homogeneity in the country, the level of urbanization in Russia. These are all factors that should make Russia much more competitive, open, and better governed than it currently is. But one of the things that's holding Russia back is its incredibly personalized autocracy and the weakened institutions that we've seen particularly over the last a decade. So in this way, there's kind of, we think about Russia's future, I think of it as a race between these structural conditions, which predict a somewhat more optimistic view, and these institutional legacies, which we know that, you know, personalist regimes tend to be replaced by other personalist regimes. They tend to have very unstable and unpredictable transitions of power. So I think it's a race between these two factors. And which of these factors wins out, I think in part depends on autocratization in the United States. I think much depends on what happens in the United States, and the outlook at the moment looks pretty grim. But it's hard to imagine a Russia that is politically competitive, open, that plays well on the international stage if the US continues on its downward autocratic slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tim. Our next speaker is Sam Greene from King's College London.
Thank you. First, I guess I'll start with some gratitude and an apology. It's gratifying to be at this panel. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years. I've been watching a number of these things online. I have learned a lot from them consistently. I consistently learn a lot from the people on the panel as well. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. The apology is that I'm going to blame the FSB on this. Somebody hacked into my King's email about a week ago. I haven't had access to it. So if there were marching orders, I haven't seen them. I do know the general topic, so I'm going to maybe go a little bit off piece, but there's a number of things that will resonate with what Tim was talking about in terms of some general themes, and I'll start probably actually where Tim started and where he ended, which is commonalities. If we think about the last 10 years. It's 10 years. It's hard to remember everything that happened in those 10 years. It's striking to remember that I was trying to think. First, I was going back to sort of 2014 and thinking that's actually 12 years, 11 years ago. 2016 was in the middle of that period somewhere, towards the beginning of that period, right? Things that now feel that they're much older than they actually are. But one of the themes that stuck out for me a lot, and that Tim was picking up on, is this idea that understanding Russia helps us understand ourselves a lot better than a lot more than maybe we would care to recognize. It is a little bit too easy, however, to misattribute that. It's now been said a lot of times, right? So when you read, I mean, the Tim Snyders of the world and others, and great writing by Masha Gessen and others, right? We understand the ways that we can recognize some of these patterns, but we tend to point the fingers sort of around the room or up the hierarchy, up the political economic food chain. And although, as Tim said, there are differences, there are also similarities, and we see them in regime behavior, autocratization. There are general patterns to this, the personalization of power. The degree to which institutions can be pushed, can be abused, can be broken. But what strikes me as somebody who was living in Moscow in 99 until 2012, so I got to see a lot of this happen on the ground, and I'm looking at Yevgeny in front of me as well. Just to take a recent example, Russian journalists and media managers fought harder in 2001 to defend Endeavor, to defend Media Most in general, to defend Itogi, to defend Kukly, Echo Moskwy, than anybody here is fighting to defend 60 Minutes or Kimmel or Colbert or whatever it is that needs defending. And to a certain extent, that's where I think we need to see the most important parallels in terms of learning from the Russian experience to understand the American experience, and not just the American experience. We see this in parts of Europe as well. There are patterns not just to what regimes are able to do, but there are patterns to what populations and citizenries allow regimes to get away with. To the ways that they value, and in many cases, it turns out, don't value politics and value institutions and value citizenship, and the things that we take for granted as categories of the structure of power are not often, or rather are often not seen the same way by the people whose political behavior we then struggle to understand. And so I think it is instructive not necessarily to think about the ways in which that Trump is like Putin, right? But to think about the ways in which our experience as Americans or as Europeans or as others mirrors aspects of the Russian experience, and to ask difficult questions about why that may be and where that may lead us. Next theme that sort of stands out for me is it sounds like an arcane academic one, but I've had the opportunity in recent years to spend some time in policy world, particularly in Washington, and I think it has real impact, which is we're learning the limits of rational choice. Or at least we should be learning the limits of rational choice as a paradigm of social scientific analysis. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Clearly it matters, right? Clearly rationality, materiality plays an important role in decisions that political actors make, whether that's ordinary citizens or people at the tops of regimes. But one of the things we should have known for centuries is that don't predict politics that's going to happen in your lifetime, right? But I was stupid enough with my colleague and friend Graham Robertson to publish a piece in the Washington Post in December 2021 saying that yes, war in Ukraine is possible because there's 200,000 troops on the border. It would have been idiotic to say that it's not, but it's not likely because it's not rational. It doesn't make sense. And we pointed to all of the things that would likely happen, and most of them did happen. There are some things we got wrong. I'll come back to them in a second. But most of the things that made the war not make sense came true, and the war still, from that perspective, doesn't make sense. And yet, it made sense to the people who were making the decision to prosecute the war. And this has cascaded right through the policymaking process since then. We've made a lot of decisions. Policymakers have made a lot of decisions with some advice from academics, some people that we all know and love who've been part of this series, right? Who have given advice about what to do with sanctions, because we thought we knew how that would shape relations within the Russian elite and between the Russian elite and the Kremlin. It didn't work, right? We made assumptions about what would happen to Russian public opinion when body bags started coming back. It didn't happen. We made assumptions about what would happen to Russian public opinion and solidarity when Ukrainian projectiles started landing in Russian territory, and that didn't happen. We made reasoned predictions about all of those things. There were plenty of things we couldn't predict. We didn't predict that Ukraine would take a chunk of Kurskaya Oblast, right? And that had no effect, right? We didn't predict that Prigozhin would start driving up the M3 from Rostov, right? And it happened, and it didn't have the effect that a lot of us were hoping it was going to have at the time, right? So we've gotten a tremendous amount wrong, despite actually knowing a tremendous amount going in. Our ability to interrogate Russian reality since 2022 has decreased. But as of February 2022, we knew a tremendous amount about Russia. And again, people like Tim and others were doing tremendous amounts of research, building that infrastructure, working in ways with scholars on the ground that were really changing the nature of knowledge production as well. We were learning from Russian scholars more than I think we ever have in history. And yet we have continually gotten things wrong. I don't know what the full answer is, but part of it is learning to take things seriously that we haven't historically taken seriously as social scientists. Learning to take the roles of ideas, of ideology, of history, of identity more seriously in policymaking. There has been excellent work coming out in recent years on that. I'm not saying it was ever ignored before. I think we have to accept that it may be more central, and we have to rethink our models, particularly if we want policymakers to get better, because if we struggle to understand it, they don't have a chance. Coming back to one last thing on that point, the problem, I agree, is not the data. Data is harder to come by, but there is still a significant amount of it. I don't think the problem is with the verifiability of the data. I've just had survey data come in the last few weeks, right? The problem, broadly speaking, isn't the answers that people are giving to the questions. It's the quality of the questions that we're asking and the quality of the theories and the concepts that we are bringing to the analysis. Sorry, I'm not timing myself, so somebody will tell me when I'm going over time. One thing moving on from that is I think we need to get better at not extrapolating from the moment. Anybody who's watched U.S. policy on the war in Ukraine in particular has seen how this happens. The war starts, and policy pivots to the idea that it's going to be over in 3 days, not because that's what the Kremlin is saying, but because that's what the Pentagon was saying. That's what the Pentagon was saying about what the Ukrainian military could withstand. That didn't happen, and projections go in almost immediately, right, to Ukraine can win this war, maybe rather rapidly. We then have the counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022, and it seems even more likely. And then that falls apart, and all of a sudden we're back in catastrophe mode. And we as a policy space, as a commentary space, are very often captured in these dramatic moments. And there's reasons, because they are dramatic, and they do capture us. We're human beings and not just social scientists. So we get caught up in that as well. But we, I think, do that in part because we're looking for ways of dealing with all of the uncertainty that all this has created. All of the things that we thought about how the world worked, right, before 2022, there couldn't be land wars, right, in Europe. We wouldn't have wars of territorial conquest in Europe. A basic assumption about politics and international relations, about how deterrence works, about how the international system works, about the importance of globalization and trading relationships, holding people into systems. All of that has fallen apart. Our ability to predict somebody like Putin, our ability to predict the Russian elite, the Russian population, as I've already discussed, has not worked. And so I think we've tended, and policymakers have tended to, rather than embracing that uncertainty and understanding the sort of the logics and the processes of contingency, to impose false certainties on the moment that we're in, right? To invest in that, and then to make policy that ends up being wrong about 48 hours later. Now that we're dealing with two sources of unpredictability, one in the Kremlin and one in the White House, that is doubled. And I'm struck by the fact that all the journalists who used to call me to ask me what Putin is thinking are now asking me what Trump is thinking, and I hate it. Okay.
He doesn't share his thoughts with you?
Neither of them do. At least with Putin, I've got like a 25-year track record that I can extrapolate from. Okay. Talking about the moment and sort of direction of travel, I think there is also a tendency that comes in to the public discussion, to the political discussion, and to the academic discussion, sometimes to read history backwards. To say everything that happened in the past has led us where we are. And on some level, that's true, because everything that's led us where we are is in the past. But people made decisions in the past, including Putin, right, based on the way that they understood the world then. Right, the information that was available to them, the interpretations that where they were in their trajectory of learning at the time, right, rather than the ones that we have now. And that, I think, I'm leveling as an indictment to sort of two schools of thought, right? One school of thought out there that says, look, this was, call it the Mearsheimer school of thought, right? That says this was inevitable because of the way that NATO was behaving. Right now, he was wrong. He was wrong. He was wrong. He was wrong. He was right. Right. If you want to look at it that way, right. But methodologically, right. He's assuming that the motivations that were present in Putin's mind in 2022 are somehow produced from a different process than whatever was producing his motivations at times in 1999. Onwards. That's simply not the way that time works, and it's not the way that cognition works, right? But similarly, the idea that the present moment was baked in as a result of, and you can pick your poison, right? As a result of the lack of lustration at the end of the Soviet Union, or as the result of latent Russian imperialism, or great power chauvinism, or racism, or what have you, colonialism. Again, pick your poison. Are all of these factors? Sure, all of them are factors. Does that create an inevitable process that led us here and will inevitably shape the future? I don't think that we should allow ourselves to fall into that trap analytically. What I'll end with is this. I think our greatest failure, and one I'm afraid that we're going to repeat over the years, and this goes back more than 10 years, is a failure to take Russia seriously. Often when people say that, what they mean is, when Putin says he doesn't like Ukraine and NATO, we should have been listening. That's not what I mean. Right? I'm borrowing this from a colleague of mine at King's, Ruth Dairman, who's been really quite cogent on the fact that the West has systematically failed not to take Russia at its word, but to believe that Russia matters. right? So that when Russia looked like it might decide to start a war, or to throw down a geopolitical or geoeconomic or any sort of a challenge to the way that the world is currently structured, we have habitually assumed that since the end of the Soviet Union, Russia is incapable of doing anything. The strength is here, the strength maybe is in China, that Russia does not have serious agency in this process. And that has come back again and again, even throughout this war, right? We have said Russia is too dysfunctional, right, to win this war. It can't manage its economy, it can't manage its military. And we saw the dysfunction on the battlefield. And yet, right, we also see that they're capable of learning, they're capable of adaptation, right, and that they have continued to fight. There is, I think, already seeping in a temptation to think that once this war ends, if Trump is able to negotiate some kind of a ceasefire, that Russia has so exhausted itself and made itself so beholden to China that we will again be able to go back to not worrying about Russia, to not taking it seriously as a factor in global politics. And if there's one lesson we've learned over the last 10 years, I hope it's that.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, our next speaker is Nina Khrushcheva, the professor in the Julien J. Studley Graduate Program of International Affairs at the New School.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's my first speaking after I came back from Moscow, so I'm fresh from Moscow. And I will look at, thank you both, because you sort of set up things for me. I will look at America, Russia from slightly different perspective, which is a bit of media studies, a bit of cultural studies. And of course, go back to the Cold War, because we talk about how seriously Russia is taken or not taken. But when America won in the Cold War, its formulas for comfort, entertainment became shared global phenomenon. So you have American tools, Facebook, Meta, Twitter, X, blogging, vlogging, whatnot, technology needs for efficiency. And that really became American victory, American global victory. So now the whole world lives in an American world. So whatever formulas we discuss, they're influenced by America at the same time. Even authoritarians, they also still take American formulas of self-promotion. By 2015, since we're talking about that, sort of the problem of global village, those of us who do media studies know it's a 1960s term. It means interconnectedness, information overload, equation of important and unimportant, basically in 15 centered around the presidency or candidacy of Donald Trump, which was treated like a fluke, but it was actually a result of a decades-long process. But the event, in talking about the problem of irrationality, seemed so irrational that America couldn't have possibly be responsible for that, because just this is not America. So the Democrats mostly, of course, shocked, attributed Trump's victory to the Russian meddling, which of course there, because Putin certainly attempted to spit into the kettle of American superiority. That whole unrecognition of Russia, by 2015, he didn't have to pay attention to how weak Russia was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he didn't think that he had to agree with that loss. So decided to shake up America by using Americans' own tools. So which is really quite a fascinating lesson to America, because America is attacked or confronted with its own invented tools, interestingly enough. But of course, Putin didn't elect Trump, which of course became even more evident when now he got elected. So for me, studying it from the media and pop culture and cultural political perspective was the 2016 victory with a confirmation of, I made up a word, please forgive me, derealitization process. So it's a derealitization. Not in vain, that very year in 2016, Oxford Dictionary had the word of the year. I don't know if anybody remembers, was very important, post-truth. That became the 2016 year, which was incredibly important. cultural and political environment where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion that appeals to emotion, personal beliefs, misinformation, and whatnot. And so I think we began observing Russian-American relations exactly from that perspective. Of course, meddling was such a hysterical drama, so it was very hard to be objective. And in fact, those of us who comment on TV would be very difficult to analyze anything because you're supposed to say that it's a bloody regime and it's going to collapse tomorrow. Otherwise, why would you be invited on MSNBC? So there's a lot of conjecture and evidence on both sides. And in fact, the foreign agent law began in 2012. But by 2015, of course, Russia also used this kind of insane formula of everybody is an enemy. America is a story of Hollywood. I'm not saying anything new. Or it is, America is what Hollywood tells us. So Trump supporters in 2016 wasn't a fluke. They voted for this mean boss from The Apprentice, the very decisive, at the time, still TV screen autocratic, but not anymore, authoritarian, has moved on with a golden toilet, who will fire, deport, insult anyone. And once again, if you studied movies or political movies, Orson Welles of Citizen Kane, 75 years later, here it is. It's exactly that. The story of Russia is different, but also interesting because suddenly in kind of around the 15, it became clear that Russia also reached its kind of its golden hour finally. And the quintessential characteristic of Russia, of course, is the KGB. I mean, whatever name it had during different periods of its power, but it is security services. So always operated around the Kremlin. With Putin, it is in the Kremlin. So it is now the whole thing. But he wasn't just is secret operative. And, you know, this is not to blame America, but America does have an insane influence on anything, even the close Soviet Union. Because you may remember that in the late of 1960s, 1970s, Yuri Andropov, who was the KGB head, he was very traumatized at the time that, you know, American spy films are all over and we don't have good Russian spies, and started this whole promotion of great films. So Putin's favorite was, I think it was The Sword and the Shield. And everybody remembers the great character Max Otto von Stirlitz, which is Colonel Maxim Isaev from the 17 Moments of Spring. He also worked in Germany. I mean, it was slightly later than Putin decided on the career, but that is, in fact, in Moscow now, in the Jewish Museum of Tolerance, which tolerance is a strange word in Moscow now, but still, they actually have an exhibition on that. And they even have a picture of Putin and a picture of Stirlitz. So here we go. And as I said, that was an American influence as well. And Putin's, let's also remember that Putin's transformation from that invisible moth that he was originally in 99 into a very muscular Russian bear happened because he was thoroughly assisted by by the American firm Ketchum. I mean, they're the ones who made him out of that into whatever we have today. So this is not criticism, it's just American influence is enormous, even if they resent and reject it. By 2015, Putin is already post-annexation of Crimea, and obviously we can say that that particular event, sort of something Sam said, not recognizing institutions anymore. I think also Tim said it as well. That was the last cobweb from the already shaken post-World War institutions. And when everybody was saying, well, that's not the rule, it was like, I don't know. I mean, what, 2001? War on terror, that wasn't the rule too. So I can do what you can do. What I also think is important is much has been done about it, but it's interesting that Trump is Putin's buddy. Because they've been other presidents in the United States that got along with the general secretaries of the Communist Party or presidents, but Trump is a buddy. That never happened. And because before there was always confrontation lurking underneath. We don't know how that buddyism would look like, but they certainly have this leader affinity. They believe in the same things. They don't believe that democracy matters. They don't believe that institutions matter. So this Putin's brand of power, the strong man in control of a big country with a lot of gold, giant spaces, is a great attraction to Trump. And basically, Trump loves that instead of being the leader of the free world. And so one of the things that that are important in all of this, because they're both attracting attention. I mean, some foreign journalists commented that if they don't put Putin in the title of an article, then the article would not get written. But the minute you have Putin, it will get clicks. Not always, but it happened with some. So in some ways, especially as of 15, although it happened earlier, we're kind of reliving there's a new installment of James Bond franchise. Trump is a climax of an American pop TV culture, a survivor in the White House, and a new spy show with a Russian asset. As you know, there have been conjectures that he must be. And Putin, of course, is mythologically that recruiter who handles the agent Trump. And for the West, of course, Putin is not president. I mean, he's a James Bond villain. He may be a villain, and he is, but he also has a point about Russian interests. However, it really is very rarely analyzed as such. Certainly since Crimea, it has not been. So the whole approach to him is very Hollywood-esque in a sense. Good guys win, and we're the good guys. Bad guys lose. And that, I think Sam mentioned that Ukraine can win. If we analyze it, we would always know that Ukraine cannot win. It couldn't have won. It can't win with what it has. And yet we kept pushing how it's going to strengthen itself or win itself on the battlefield and whatnot. Interesting, authoritarianism is always personalized. Democracy is not. And yet we experiencing equally personalized politics, both from the Kremlin and the White House. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And so to conclude my sort of media type kind of view of that, what we're witnessing, we've never seen that. I don't know how it's going to play out and how maybe we'll get back to reality. I doubt, but potentially maybe. We are now watching in disbelief the merging of two dystopias, which is Brave New World, written in 1932, and George Orwell's 1984, written in 49. Seriously. In Brave New World, Huxley described the human race by 2540, destroyed by ignorance, lust for entertainment, dominance of technology, or abundance of material goods, and so on. Trump, by the way, arrived 500 years ahead of schedule. In Russia, it is George Orwell's 1984, which is compared and uncompared. But as somebody who has been going there for the last 3.5 years, I'm telling you, I've never lived in George Orwell. You've never lived in George Orwell. Russia now is an actual George Orwell. So Putin is a big brother declaring that war is peace in Ukraine. He's O'Brien from the INA party. INA party is United Russia Party, right? Very, very appropriate, working for Ministry of Truth, which lies all the time, and Ministry of Love that arrests and tortures. So the last 10 years really, for me, was a representation, a sort of transformation of norms and institutions that gave way to fictionalized facts, a reality of simulation, replaced alternative reality. It exists in physical world, but reshapes and manipulates it, moving it closer to simulacrum. America is still a simulation. It has some hope. If you don't know what simulation is, it's a kind of copy of reality, but moving away from it. Russia is already a simulacrum because it's a seasoned dictatorship, so it's very Orwellian simulacrum. And simulacrum is when a copy has no connection to reality, which is exactly what Russia is now. So it is, in Russian terms, it's a Potemkin village of a Potemkin village. So there's actually no physical thing before the Potemkin village. So 84 is a real life. And one example, if we look at foreign policy, Sergei Lavrov, who just went to Alaska, he went in a T-shirt representing the country that doesn't exist. So that's a perfect example of simulacrum. So, and I wanted to talk about fascism, but I think I'm out of time, so I'm not going to go. I just fear that even if we don't get to the full fascist mode, and both of them were criticized for essentially promoting that ideology, is that we are so entertained by their existence. I mean, it's every headline is Trump and every headline is Putin. We can't get our eyes off them, even if we can't stand them. And so I wonder if by doing that, we're gradually losing our capacity to distinguish between lived reality and whatever formulas we have in our heads. And to conclude, Huxley explained, because he was, after he wrote, and then he actually argued a lot with George Orwell, that his Brave New World is much more important than 1984. So his argument, in the future, dictators will understand that if you want to stay in power, you have to get consent. As I predicted in Brave New World, this will be done with drugs and new propaganda techniques. It will bypass the rational side of man and appeal to his subconsciousness, deep emotions, and physiology, and make him truly love slavery. And of course, in Orwell, freedom is slavery too. So thank you.
Okay, our final speaker today is Maria Snegovia, a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia within the Russia Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also an adjunct professor in Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service.
Thank you so much. Really honored to be here. It's a tough task for me to speak after so many esteemed participants, who some of them are my former professors. So it's a double responsibility. And I wanted to extend my deep thanks to Alex and Josh and Carnegie Foundation for generous funding of this endeavor, from which I benefited a lot. Esteemed presenters before me talked about more of the domestic elements of the current trends, all of them quite sobering. I thought, since I do a lot of foreign policy work these days, I will focus a little bit more on that angle and the lessons learned. And I think that, if anything, to go back to the theme of this workshop, the event, the lessons learned from the last 10 years, I think, if anything, the last 10 years have contributed a lot of clarity, analytical clarity, that we did not have before with the last 35 years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that I think, while sobering in a lot of ways, quite helpful analytically going forward for us to understand what's going on. And the way I structure this, first I want to explain what happened from where I come from. This is partly based on the new manuscript of the book that I just submitted to Oxford about Russia's foreign policy continuities. And the second half will be devoted to the lessons learned. Now, I think the key element of the key way to sum up the last 35 years is that the history refuses to end. A lot of the early 1990s was premised on this very, I'd say, naive optimism about the fact that Russia will eventually rejoin or join the group of the Western liberal democracies. Basically, as Michael Kimmage, our colleague, summed it up, premised on the idea that where America was, Russia would follow, eventually adopting market reforms, democratic reforms, and joining. And yet, over the past 30 years, while much of the American policy and Western policy more broadly towards Russia was premised on this assumption, and literally every single president, like Trump did get a lot of bad notoriety based on his effort to outreach to Putin in Alaska, but just a reminder that this was the policy of every single American president when coming to power, is trying to reset in one way or another relationship with Russia. Every single time that failed, and in fact, every single American president left office facing even worse relations with Russia than when he took office, from which we have to unfortunately come to the conclusion that the West is not really unilaterally to blame for what has happened. As a matter of fact, it is Russia. Russia is the problem, and that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about. And the last 10 years in particular, I think this has become more clear because since 2014, we have witnessed unprecedented escalation in Russian actions. International assertiveness has grown dramatically. That started with annexation of Crimea, then the war in eastern Ukraine, sending troops to Syria, sending mercenaries to Libya and sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually, most horribly, this horrible full-scale invasion of Ukraine. History did not end. In fact, it returned with a vengeance. Now, I, in my analysis, argue that a lot of the explanation that's sometimes missed, but Tim, for example, hinted at it in his analysis, is premised on the fact that I think we misinterpreted a little bit what happened in Russia in early 1990s. That it wasn't a revolution in the more classical sense in which it's understood. And here I have to go back to also what Sam said about like some of the facts that we hold true no matter what, without necessarily providing more nuanced framework. So what we see in Russia is indeed a change of regime. But what we also see in Russia is really limited change in the elites. This is the point that I made repeatedly in a variety of publications. Indeed, elite continuity after regime change is completely normal, right? You see it in absolutely like pretty much every single case, post-fascist Italy, post-Nazi Germany, post-communist Hungary and Poland. However, in Russian case, we're not just talking of mere elite continuity. We're talking of almost entire preservation of elites, of the Soviet elites, like nomenclature. These are the groups that required, this is the all the positions in the Soviet system that required Communist Party approval. So these groups continued in power to a large extent unchanged, much in a way that was much more pronounced compared to pretty much every country in Eastern Europe, post-communist Eastern Europe. And as I show in actually some of the analysis that we've done, when you look at the nomenclature continuity in Russia today, Russia is by far the leader among not just post-communist European states, but also all of the 15 post-Soviet states, including the most authoritarian Central Asian regimes. And just to give you perhaps some of the data, among top 100 elites in Russia, in 1992, we estimate about 73% of the elites, top elites, who had nomenclature positions before. But if you, like today, it's more like 37–40%, still quite significant, given that it's more than one generation later. But if you can argue to the extent that this change has happened, the rotation did occur, it happened primarily in non-foreign policy related areas of Russia's government, which is crucial for our discussion today. So yes, economic departments, right, so much more high influx of new reformers, but specifically in Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, presidential administration, which is, by the way, the reincarnated apparatus of the CPSU Central Committee, which Gorbachev deliberately structured after it and brought a lot of personnel from the former Soviet structure into it, and Security Council, which is the main advisory body on foreign policy making to the Russian president. All of them has seen really strong continuity of the Soviet elites. In the Security Councils, just to give you the numbers, 1992 and 1994 Security Council, about 90% nomenclature. Now it's about 70% still. And just to be sure, we're not talking about the top Politburo positions. Those were gone, but they were often replaced with just lower ranked ones, groups. And why does it matter? It matters because in the Soviet Union, you couldn't just make it in nomenclature. It actually was a highly closed off, deeply intertwined, indoctrinated, and carefully selected group that also by default almost bared certain attitudes, certain beliefs that unfortunately, as I argue, do end up influencing Russian foreign policy making even today. Now, Putin's rise to power is also a byproduct of that same process. He himself, as among others, Evgenia Albas, who is here in the audience, has shown, comes from the unreformed or only very partially tangentially reformed Soviet institutions like KGB, FSB, within the Soviet power structures, but he's just part of this broader process of the broader continuity of the elites and hence networks and mindsets that continue to influence Russian foreign policy making today. Now, why does it matter for foreign policy? Like, okay, so there's always elite continuity and we have it in Russia. Why do I talk a lot about this? So, and this is where I wanted to go to the second half of my presentation, lessons learned. Now, a lot has been made, and Tim in particular mentioned that as Russia has become more autocratic, it has become a little bit more predictable. I have to disagree with that a little bit. Specifically on the foreign policy, Russian elites, I would argue, are actually quite consistent, and they actually tell that to us. Much like the Soviet elites, this is unique to foreign policy making. They actually quite openly communicate about their goals. And for example, Stephen Kotkin, the prominent historian, has repeatedly flagged that the key secret, the key discovery of the communist archives was that in private, Soviet leaders were what you would expect, they were Marxist. And unfortunately, that's very much the same is true. If you listen to Putin pretty much since 2007, he's been saying for a while what he's doing now. And that is not unique to him. That is actually the feature, not a bug, of many of the elites in his environment, and not just Putin's elites. It's also the case under Yeltsin. You see consistently how the reconciliation of the old nomenclatura elites start influencing Russian foreign policy already since 1993, 1994 in a very slow, but nonetheless consistent revanchist direction. While indeed they shed the Marxist-Leninist ideology, and these beliefs are not as structured and they are not as all-encompassing as Marxist-Leninist worldview used to be, those are nonetheless the beliefs that include perception of the international environment as being highly hostile, zero-sum, and Russia being encircled or being under the threat of encirclement coming primarily from the West. The anti-Western legacy is very pronounced, I would argue, even if, of course, you can object there were interim periods when it wasn't the case, and I'm happy to address that later. The other element of continuity is Russian exceptionalism, the belief that Russia is its own thing, today most notably represented by this notion of civilization Russia, and of course the sense of entitlement over post-Soviet areas, Russia's imperialism, which obviously most dramatically seen in the recent war in Ukraine. Many, in our academic circles, the prominent counter-argument claims that, like Mersheimer's offensive realist argument claims that those are just very natural, realpolitik, realist responses to the threats. But even if you look full realist lenses on what Russian elites are doing, and I don't object to the fact that a degree of geopolitical thinking, realpolitik, does of course impact Russian calculus, but you cannot deny that it's in a lot of ways a twisted realism, meaning that, for example, the Kremlin tends to really overreact to developments that are not necessarily overly threatening from a strictly balance of power perspective. You also cannot explain Russia's dramatic over-reliance on China that started not in 2022, but actually in 2014, at least, strictly by a realist calculus. So there's more to that, and I argue that has direct Soviet legacy that affects this behavior, this perception. So if you drop Marxist-Leninism, you see a lot of that being reflected in Russian foreign policy. So in the sense, yes, we do have a different Russia, but in a lot of ways we have a Russia that's highly influenced by that old Soviet legacies, which we failed to notice at the start. Second point is about the illusion of the fixed national interest. This is important for Western policy making vis-a-vis Russia, because much of the Western policy was premised for a while on the idea that Russia's national interest is objectively in joining, Western European alliance, and perhaps like for interconnectedness, trade, eventually living peacefully in a positive side reality, so as like sort of mutually benefiting from this arrangement. Right, but as I argue, and much of the constructivist scholarship also argues, national interest is not fixed. It's actually constructed by the elites, and that as long as you have the elites that see the reality for particular lenses, it goes back to Sam's point about rationality. I'd say it's bounded rationality, borrowing from economics. They will see the national interest in very different lenses. And Putin, within his worldview, is not rational. It's just that his point, this destination, right, from point to A to point B, he's picking the shortest trajectory. That's rational. The problem is that where he's trying to get, the point B from our perspective, where he's trying to get, is rational, but it's not irrational within that framework. So the elites and the way they shape perception of the national interest and what shapes their perception of national interest is highly important and should not be discarded in the analysis. Third point, I don't think it's right to claim that the West won the Cold War. As a matter of fact, and I would refer to a great book by historian Vladislav Zubok, for example, who named Collapse. The end of the Soviet Union was largely a product of miscalculation of Gorbachev and political economic reforms that he implemented without understanding the consequences. Those reforms unleashed a tsunami of far-reaching consequences, which incentivized international liberal movements across the region, exacerbated already existing economic problems within the system, and most importantly, split the elites, which allowed Boris Yeltsin to eventually seize control and dismantle the system. But the Western leverage in that process, while not non-existent, was actually quite minimal. And the ability of the West to generally influence the processes in Russia and in the Soviet Union, even more so, always consistently remained limited, nor was there a lot of political will on the side of the West to do that. If you look at the Bush/Clinton electoral campaign, it became pretty early in the 1990s that Clinton in particular had no intention in seriously engaging with Russia at the time, nor was it really nor were there a lot of opportunities to do that, given the nature of the elites that I already flagged before. And ironic, and also we tended to believe that the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully. But now I think it's pretty clear that the collapse was just delayed. The consequences of the collapse were delayed by a certain number of years that allowed Russia to regain some of its former economic capabilities, might, and eventually recreate the attempt to reassemble those groups. Somewhat ironically, the very peaceful nature of the Soviet dissolution kind of reinforced the problem because it allowed more elites from the former regime to hold on to power in a way that unfortunately later influenced Russia's subsequent trajectory in this negative along this negative spiral. Fourth point, has the Cold War really ended? Because at least that's not what the Russian elites think. If you listen to Putin, if you listen to many of them, they actually keep insisting that the West was always after them. At least in their view, the Cold War is very much the same Cold War, which was just briefly interrupted by the so-called, to cite Lenin, temporary respite in the 1990s when Russia was weak. But now it's just it's sort of continued again, and the West yet again, to quote Putin, for decades, if not centuries, for many, many years, is trying to contain Russia. So to the extent to which the end of the Cold War really happened, I think also should be reanalyzed in that sense, and perhaps more analysis should be premised on what worked and not worked in our previous effort to contain Russia. And I do, of course, have a lot to say about the Russian society as well, but I want to be cognizant of the time. Perhaps during the Q&A, we can raise those questions. In the meantime, I will just return to my early point. I think the last 10 years were extremely sobering, but also awakening from the analytical perspective. Many things and illusions are now gone. And in some ways, it's good things because forewarned is forearmed. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you all. So let's turn to Q&A, and let's start with the live audience first. So if you have a question, raise your hand and just tell us who you are in the question. Yes, in the back.
We've been volunteers for the year, and my question is for Professor Frye. I was curious when you hear that you said that it is possible to conduct public opinion polling in Russia. I've assumed the answer would be no to that. So I was wondering if you could expound upon that. It means that there would be so many levels of fear that you would have to work through in getting people.
Good. Well, Sam, you might want to. You have fresh data, so you might even be able to comment on this. Yeah. So I think the problem when we do surveys, you ask lots of kinds of questions. Some of them are sensitive, and some of them are not. So to ask kind of non-sensitive questions, I think is not particularly a problem. When you do ask more sensitive questions, you're constrained in a number of ways. You can't call the war a war. You have to call it a special military operation. And in order to convince reviewers that your data is of some value, you have to go to great lengths. So we have with my co-authors that I mentioned before, we have a paper on support for the war in Russia. And we had to write a whole nother paper to demonstrate that where we thought there were biases in the data and where we thought the data were strong. For example, one of the things we were concerned about was that the people who answered the question in December of 2021 would fall out of the sample when we interviewed them again in September 2023. And we found that that number was actually a very small number. So just compared to other kinds of panel surveys, the dropout rate was kind of well in line with what one would expect. We also did a bunch of these list experiments that are questions designed to try to figure out whether or not respondents are dissembling.
Give us an example of that, Tim.
Oh, okay.
Because I think for the audience,
Good,
it's
yeah,
very
good.
interesting methodologically. Yeah.
Good. So the idea is for example, I have one paper with co-authors where we tried to figure out whether or not people were lying when they answered the "Is Putin popular?" question. Do you approve the political activities of Vladimir Putin? So one way to do that is to ask directly. When we asked this question, I wrote the paper with 3 co-authors. 2 of us thought that Russians were lying. 2 of us thought not. So we went into this pretty open-minded. And so we asked a direct question, but then we also split the sample into 2 groups. One group received a list of Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and Stalin. And we asked them, tell me how many of these leaders do you support? Don't tell me which ones, just tell me how many. So say the answer was on average was 1. So then the other half of the sample, which simply by the law of large numbers was identical to the other group, we gave the same question, but we also included Putin's name, right? And we said, tell me how many of these leaders you approve of, but don't tell me which ones. So we found that about the average was about 1.8, right? So simply by adding Putin's name to this list, we found that about 80% of Russians approved of Putin, which was pretty close, although not exactly the same as the direct question. When we did that in 2016, we couldn't rule out that people were answering the question honestly, right? When we did it again in 2021 and in 2021, the kind of our confidence in our ability to make that claim was weakened for a bunch of these reasons. But when we asked questions about the war, and the basic question we asked is, do you support a continuation of the special military operation or not? And we also asked that in this same kind of a list format, and we got responses that were pretty similar to what we got in the direct question. So the social sciences are really sneaky. And we have lots of ways to try to figure out whether or not people are lying. We often know the direction of the bias, and what we're concerned about is how big the bias is. So one alternative is not to do survey research. Another is to do kind of simple interviews. They have a lot of the same problems as well. Another thing that we try to do is to do the actual surveys and try to figure out where we can be confident and where we cannot be confident in our answers. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. So I think you can do it, but it is much more difficult today.
And I take a very different approach, right? I also come at things from a different methodological, different disciplinary perspective. That I come at things a little bit more sociologically, and I don't actually care whether people are telling the truth, right? Because behavior isn't truthful, right? And what I'm trying to understand is what shapes the behavior that we observe out there in the world. Right now, I can't recreate a kitchen table conversation, right, in a survey or in a focus group, but there are some approximations that can be created. And what I want to do in the work that I'm trying to do, at least, is to understand the processes and the factors that will lead some people to say that I support the war, or to avoid that question entirely, right? And we have to take the silence
Yeah.
seriously as well in these questions, as well as to understand, okay, what makes those factors, those social experiences, those processes that create responses, that create behaviors, different across different groups of people or across different modes of seeing the world, right? So we've been talking a lot this evening about sort of differences in interpretation, how people take the material aspects of their lives and translate them into a worldview that then motivates behaviors that we might think of as not fully rational. Well, we want to understand something more about that process. And if we use the surveys as an attempt not to get some kind of ground truth, right, but as an attempt to excavate that social process that produces an answer, right, then I think that there's a lot that we can learn.
So
How big was your sample?
Sorry?
How big was your sample?
My last sample was about 2,100 people.
And across?
We had 4 experimental cohorts, so
Yeah, but what
but
Yeah.
geography?
broadly nationally representative. It wasn't. I'll say one thing. Online surveys, they're the easiest to do, and almost at this point, kind of the only thing that we can get through an ethics board. But at least where I work, but they're getting more difficult to get to approximate representativeness. It's getting, for a reason I don't fully understand, but it's getting harder to get to the margins of the age distribution, to get to the margins of the geographical distribution. It's skewing more heavily towards higher education, and so it's as a result, right? But because I'm not interested in the ground truth so much, I'm not trying to say what percent of Russians, support the war. I'm trying to say people in Russia who have a certain set of experiences and a certain maybe social psychological, framework, tend to respond to stimuli in a certain way, right? Tend to think about the world in a certain way. I'm not making any arguments about what percentage of the population that is. That's a question I can't answer.
Yeah, Nina, do you want to?
Can I just add something because I was fresh from there? And a lot of data that is presented seems accurate, but it's also interesting when you talk to people, and which I do all the time, how not depending even on the question, but also depending, as you say, on the environment. Putin is great. Well, we prove suddenly, finally, Russia is recognized, all wonderful. And then another 15 minutes is, this is horrible, what an idiot, these are idiots, this is ridiculous, how horrible, when does the war ends, and so on and so forth. So what do we take out of this? Is it Putin is great, or how horrible that is? They just did even Levada, they did a happiness survey, which of course, anybody who knows Russia, happiness is not the thing that we do that much, but it's called a happiness survey, great. Oh, wonderful, it's how you're content with your life. And so since 93, Russians are the most content with their life now. Only 11% are not content, which is not what you see potentially. So I actually made a huge effort to find a person who participated in the Levada surveys for many different things. Where we meeting in a bookstore, those who know Moscow may remember Respublika, it's a very posh bookstore, which is also interesting, a sign of, I mean, it's not hard data, but it is some data. Before the war, they would be Putin mugs and Putin calendars, because he was sort of a pop culture guy. The minute the war began, there's no Putin. You wouldn't know that there is Putin in that bookstore. You wouldn't know there is war in the bookstore. You just absolutely wouldn't know. What you do know, there are 4 versions of 1984 everywhere. So just you wouldn't forget where you are. So I met this young woman named Svetlana, and she says to me, "I'm happy." I'm like, "Wait a minute, what are you, Russian? Why are you happy?" And it was a very, very interesting way of looking at the survey. So she explained to me, she said, the reason I said I was happy, because in 2022, she was 20. My life was over. I went to protest. It immediately, I was everything you mean. I thought I had no future. And Putin made a great mistake, I think, but now we see, because it was supposed to be short war and didn't end up. You cannot have military operation for 3.5 years, because the idea was you're going to do it. You're not going to upset people. You're going to continue, pretend that they live their own lives. But now he pretended, and suddenly the war is his, but not the people's. There's absolutely not a national war that the way they present. And so this girl said, life continues. I signed up amazingly with all the restrictions. You can sign up on Stanford and Harvard professors online through RBK. So she signed up. She takes classes in Russia while doing this. And it's one of these ridiculous things because Russia is kind of an imitation culture. So she was proud. She was offering me a drink they call Bumble. I'm like, wait, what's Bumble? Schmeal. Bumble, it's orange juice and espresso. Disgusting. And she said to me, "Oh, this is the latest thing in Berlin." I was like, "Did you go to Berlin?" Like, no, I didn't go to Berlin, of course. So it's completely what is amazing with all this bullshit about Russian traditional values and all this. This is an entirely global environment, including the signs in the store that actually they push the books on the second floor now. So if anybody comes to check, so they're not going to climb to the second floor. But they have candles, they have notebooks, they have Pringles, sanctions, no, who cares? Coca-Cola, coffee quarters, it's so high life. And signs next to the candles. You know, it's a candle. I mean, you wouldn't confuse it with anything else. It says candles in English. And it's exactly, they put it when Putin signed a law that you're supposed to have in Cyrillic. So all of these things, they're not going to go into a survey, but they certainly provide some sort of social environment that it's hard to capture.
Can I also ask Maria to weigh in on the domestic scene? Because also in a previous career and life, she was a correspondent.
Not really good. I was actually a biweekly columnist.
A columnist in taking the economic mood of Russians. So
in December last year, I published a report which also drew on Tim Frye and his colleagues' excellent paper, but I also interviewed a number of pollsters still working in Russia, looking at the variety, searching for a variety of disruptions biases in the samples. And there's beyond just, less experiments, there's a variety of ways to track it. For example, like has the sample changed in terms of, for example, like some non-sensitive indicators, like how many people wear glasses and things like that. So they do a variety of these things. There's an entire list of indicators, and they basically have seen that most of, like literally everyone says that there's no major disruptions in the sample composition. And I think the problem is when we look at the Russian state and we say, how is this possible, is that we tend to over-focus on a relatively small, unfortunately, increasingly marginalized segment of the Russian population, which is sort of like us, liberal pro-Western Russians, but even the unprecedented exodus of the people who belong primarily to that group since 2022, it's about 600,000 to 1 million people, did not radically alter the sample compositions because they were a minority in those samples to begin with. People with consistently pro-Western liberal groups constitute about 7-10 percentage point. In the samples typically. Then you argue, like, yes, we see the anti-war segment typically constitutes 20% in most of the surveys, but that does not only include pro-Western liberals, sort of people like-minded individuals who probably go to that bookshop where Nina was, but also actually poor, worse off economically people who just think that money should be spent in different way. So I just think that, unfortunately, a lot of the reality, including the repressiveness and all these disruptions that are relevant to us, just tend not to concern a really large chunk of the Russian society. Because if you think that Russians oppose the war or do not accept this war, this is not Russia's war, then how do you explain that that this is, first of all, fifth war that Putin has started? It's a tremendously costly war. It's been already 1 million casualties on the Russian side, and it's more casualties than any war Russia plus Soviet Union have fought combined since the end of the Second World War. And yet, despite all this horrible disruption, dislocations has created, he's able to continue. And in fact, he is quite successfully recruiting 30,000 to 40,000 people per month to go die in this meat grinder. I think that it's just hard, like some said that it's about like, what was the formulation that behavior isn't truthful. We see the behavior. right? We need to account of this behavior somehow, and claiming that everybody, well, most Russians disagree with the war just does not help us understand how this horrible, atrocious war has been lasting for 3.5 years and how we have seen the same pattern. And it's not the first war that has been fought.
I'm sorry, we do understand this very well.
Absolutely.
We do understand it very
Yeah,
well because
very well.
it's the first war. Where it's not people who are fighting in the army. There are mercenaries.
Right, exactly.
And these people who hire 30,000 to 40,000 each month and approximately the same amount die each month, these people who are paid for that, their mean salary in the regions, we know this very well, their mean salary in the regions was 20,000 rubles, approximately $200, $250 per month. They receive from start right away 200, 400 million rubles. That's what they receive on contract. And if you see across the board, you see that each month, different regions raise their contract money, and then they receive. So once again, we remember they used to have 20,000 rubles a month. And now they receive a month 800,000 rubles. They paid for each wound, for for taking part in so-called мясные штурмы, and etc., etc. So we do know it very well. It's not because people support or not support. They recruit people predominantly from the poorest parts of the Russian Federation, where there were no jobs, no ways to live, and mothers and wives themselves, they bring their alcoholics, and there is this huge, alcoholization of the Russian population. In the Soviet Union, there were 30 million alcoholics for 300 million people. So they bring them to these military posts, and they sign the contract because otherwise they're totally useless. They're useless as lovers.
I want, yeah.
Finish this.
Yeah.
They're useless as lovers, they're useless as fathers, they're useless as husbands, they're useless as workers.
Okay. Let us, okay,
And so why do you say, I'm just surprised.
perfect. So let's give her a chance to respond,
Okay,
right?
sorry.
Thank you. And let us actually,
Take some more questions.
let's take some more questions.
Yeah.
Hold the response in mind. Do you have anyone online that you want to turn to?
We do have one online. We have only one question online, so I'll encourage more people online to ask questions. But why don't we take another couple from the room and then we'll go to
Sounds
online as well. So in the back and then Anton. Oh, yeah, go ahead. We'll take a couple.
My name is Vladislav Davidson. I'm a colleague of Maria. I've been suspended for spending too much time on Twitter, but I am technically a colleague of Maria. That aside, my name is Vladislav Davidson. I'm a writer, journalist, editor. And first of all, lovely to hear for the first time someone in Russia, Ukraine analysis say, mea culpa, we've got so many things wrong. There were so many ludicrous things being said in 22 and early 23 about the war from all sorts of experts that I don't know why the general population would ever listen to any of us ever again. So that's good. But the question is this, and I say this as having led investigation into Russiagate for an unnamed streaming platform, which made me sign an NDA. It's amazing that none four of you didn't say anything about the main issue between Russia and Ukraine in some ways over the last 10 years, which was the destruction of the legacy media's credibility. I'm a member of it by conspiracy theories between 16 and 18. Russiagate was just like a tremendous, insane, frothing thing that we've now memory hold, but it cratered my industry, and it still formats the way that Donald Trump thinks about Russian and Ukrainian relations. And I say this as not a huge fan of Donald Trump or whatever. Not that I have to. I mean, one has to kind of say that in an academic conference, but I mean, just it's kind of amazing that no one mentioned that.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I mentioned it.
I'm sorry.
I mentioned it. I spoke about it.
Or maybe I was about. Okay.
All right, let's take a couple questions. Paul.
Thanks really for a really interesting discussion. I have a question really for the whole panel, but it's about the nature and extent of elite commitment, ideological commitment. Sam raised the point that we need to take ideas and ideology into consideration more often. Maria's comments really sort of, I think, highlight some important continuities in terms of ideological repertoires that are inherited. But to what extent are those ideological repertoires being mobilized in an instrumental fashion? And how enduring are they? And likewise, if in looking at Russia, we learn about ourselves, what do we learn about American elites' ideological commitments from looking at Russia?
Okay, so to the panel. Anyone want to go ahead and any of the questions that have been asked?
Maybe I'll just briefly, I mean, I do think that Nina mentioned Russia again. I did mention 2016 in passing, I suppose. I think, and this is something actually that's really quite important, but I think this goes actually well back before Russia again. So I don't lay it entirely at the end of that. I think Nina used the term, I wrote it down even, the fictionalized facts. I think we also have factualized fiction in which, all of a sudden people can just make up stories and tell them things. To me, this is another area, right, in which the studying Russia and studying the U.S. in parallel would actually be quite useful. Right? I can always say this in an academic setting, otherwise I get myself in lots of trouble, right? But
You still may.
I still may, right? But I did a piece where I haven't published this, but it's sitting somewhere on a computer where I looked at sort of narrative construction and framing around actually the Belarusian protest movement in 2020, right? And January 6th movement, right? Moment, at least in this country. There are some things that are very similar and some things that are very different. The thing that's very different, right, which is critical, is violence. Right? You have one community that legitimizes violence and thinks that violence is appropriate, and one that does not. And there are antecedents for that and reasons for that, which I don't want to belittle, right? But you do have communities of people that cease to believe that institutions, settings can work in their favor, right? Can work in their interest, and that they have a stake in their appropriateness. Something that Tim was also talking about, the democratization. I think the issue that we need to recognize, right, there is that that's not, I think, the result of something that media did. It's not the result of some story, whether it's Russiagate or something else. It's a result of a long breakdown, right, in the relationship between citizens and the state, which we as Russianists have observed in the former Soviet Union, going back to the Soviet Union itself, right, and something that I think we haven't been prepared to observe in this country or in the UK, where I live, and people vote for Brexit and do all kinds of other crazy things. Paul, to your question, I mean, this is something I'm laying at my own door. I'm happy that I don't study elites mostly, right? But I think I have always assumed in my own sort of modeling of Russian politics, right, that I can take ideas seriously when I look at citizens, and I don't kind of tend to take them seriously when I look at elites, because I always tend to assume that elites are cynical, right? They're more materially interested, right? Because they operate on some level. I'm not sure I've really had a good reason for that, but I've had to come to terms with the fact that elites are people too, right? And that they also have ideas, and they look in the mirror in the morning and they tell themselves stories about what they're doing and why they're doing it. In fact, maybe even more than masses do. But if they're people too, then I think we don't want to go too far in the other direction, which is, I'm going to point to something that Nina was mentioning, right? This phenomenon of having one opinion when we're first asked a question, and then it kind of mutating 15 minutes, and we can all recognize that, right? We all go through phases in the day, and depending on who we're talking to and what we had for breakfast, right, things are going to change. And so I mean, I'm a little conscious of who I'm saying this to, someone who actually studies nationalism, right? But I think we often tend to think that these things are more immutable in the minds of an individual than they are. And I think what we've seen in Russia is how quickly people could go from, as Tim was mentioning, the 8% to think that invading Ukraine is a good idea, right, to 80% that think that invading Ukraine is a good idea, right?
Which was never, by the way.
Well, but whatever the number is, right? You have people accommodating themselves to the situations that they're in, and assimilating ideas that are current in that situation, and then those can move on, right? So I think this is, again, I'll start with this. Coming back to my point about sort of not extrapolating from the moment, that comes down to ideas, whether it's in the heads of masses or elites too. I know we want to assume that just because people moved into a liberal movement in the 1990s meant they would stay there. Just because people have moved into a nationalist moment now means that they will stay there for the rest of their mortal lives. I don't know that that's true.
Well said.
To Paul first and then to Evgenia. Paul, so it's always an inevitable simplification, right? What we're looking at, and the elites are even arguably harder to study than the Russian population. But essentially, looking at the literature, you can sort of segregate the elites into three groups. The small westernizer faction, like more or less the liberal vision of Russian integration, the civilizationist faction, or you call it like the hawkish group, the typically Siloviki we see in the Soviet Union, this group being represented primarily by the military-industrial complex and the MOD, and the interim category of the statists, who are more great power balances. I'd say Primakov is a classic example of it, but they're still leaning closer to the civilizationist. And I think often missed like the question is like, if the preferences are constant, how do we explain fluctuations in the Russian policy? The often missed element there is actually quite realist, and that's material capabilities. Is that when they have the money, it sort of unlocks this very toxic dynamic of log rolling that Jack Snyder in particular has written about, which then makes it much harder to resist the constant demand for like fund some sort of military resources into the military complex, which then creates more assertiveness, sort of vicious loop, and especially given their original leanings. So there's got to be something that activates it. On the contrary, when there's no resources, Russia becomes highly like peaceful, very sad, effort to maybe detente, and you see this pattern being quite consistent in Russian history. So it's not a constant. And to Evgenia Markovna. So first of all, one particular point about Russian society and the structures that we haven't mentioned, the term is neo-patrimonialism, I think is highly important. Essentially, the nature of the political system where civic society is relatively weak and power and resources distributed based on personal loyalty rather than formal.
I read Hale's book.
Of course, no, I'm talking to the rest of the audience also. Not everybody may be so knowledgeable. And the problem is here is that the Russian society, many of the Russian population, right, are fellow travelers more often with the Russian leadership. When in the past the Kremlin was embarking on its past military adventures, the mass opinion either did not disagree and follow, or not create sufficient cost for the Kremlin, right? And the question is, so a lot of followers, so they follow the lead. We see this dynamic that Tim flagged, that they oppose the invasion, even sometimes 2 weeks before, right? But suddenly then shift to embrace it. It has just doesn't happen in 2022. Same we have seen in 2014, in 2015, Syria. Absolutely same dynamic. And the real debate in the community of Russian experts is about these groups that are shifting their positions, following the Kremlin lead. I completely agree with everything you said about the way the Kremlin organizes their recruitment, and we ourselves publish a lot about that. What we disagree is how to interpret that, right? My point is that they're not being forced. They're being offered money and they voluntarily sign up. And the rest of the society sort of accepts this reality where the war is outsourced to these unfortunate groups, sort of quote unquote basket of deplorables, if you will, horrible quote, but nonetheless I think it's fitting. And the question is, which group do we put them in? My point is here is that what we have seen on the ground in reality does not contradict the evidence that at least significant chunk of the society accept this, does not radically oppose it because
you know that. I'm just
Yeah, no, I'm too. I'm sorry, because
how do you
accepting
there's no
it,
data to
accepting
say that.
accepting it.
Okay. Up.
Can I just, accepting it is not supporting, and I think
That's
this is
the
a
key
very
debate.
important point.
Right, so I think Josh has a concluding question for you and to Tim, and you can roll.
Yeah, so we have some question from online, and which will take us a little bit away from this the question of the data, but more to the bigger picture topic that we wanted to get at a little bit here, which is what it's meant to comment on U.S.-Russian relations. And I think we have seen that commenting on U.S.-Russian relations can be very passionate and it can lead to a lot of disagreement from lots of people who are incredibly well informed. But we have a question from a Harriman alum, Lisa Bernard, who writes, in commenting on U.S.-Russian relations, is commenting on U.S.-Russian relations made more difficult by fears or concerns that the American expert or journalist will be labeled as left or right rather than apolitically analytical, given the hyper-politicized state of the nation? In other words, if one speaks to a policy that is associated with one party or the other, does it doom that analyst or Russian expert to the wrath, even isolation, of the opposing political types? This is very much obviously a question of the moment, but I think it also goes back, to Sam's point about like, what is the role of expertise right now? So I guess I would kind of come full circle back to where you started earlier and say, is the moment that we are in right now, has it made it more difficult to be an analyst? Not just because of, there's a whole kind of media moment that we're in right now, and what type of information is privileged on media and clicks and vertical video and all these sorts of things, but because of also the politicization in the country. Is it become harder to be an objective analyst in this kind of context that we're in right now?
I
Tim.
can start.
Yeah.
I think I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest person on this panel, so I can speak. So
Certainly older than I am.
So when we think about, I cut my teeth on the Steve Cohen, Richard Pipes debates of the 1980s. So if we talk about the politicization of the field, the bar was really high back then. And I think what the generation that followed recognized that that was not a path that we wanted to go down. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do in my own research is to use all the work that the scholarly community is bringing to the table to try to just give people more nuanced views, not necessarily to convince anybody in a partisan fashion, because so much of what we study doesn't fall easily into partisan categories. But we do have people doing really interesting work that people should know about, not just the data that they're gathering, the basic facts on the ground, but also how they interpret it. And also, I think there is a kind of I think on Russia policy, the political environment is much less politicized than it is on other kinds of questions. I mean, from my time, I spent 6 months at the Library of Congress and interacting with many people on Capitol Hill. Like, the moderate Republicans went out of their way to tell me, and this is in 2023, don't worry, we're still going to keep the sanctions on. And now they're just keeping their head down and being loyal Republicans. But I think privately, and if it weren't for the political considerations, I think most Republicans have a very negative view of Putin, like 80%. So when you do public opinion polling, so in a sense, we're in a little bit of a privileged space compared to commenting on, say, higher education in the United States, which might be a more volatile topic. Finally, I think the last thing that we can do as analysts is to correct some of the obviously problematic things that people say. So one of the things that struck me in the 6 months I was in DC and in meeting with people in the US bureaucracy, I can't remember how many times people asked me, is Russia going to break up? Right?
Yeah.
Should we really be worried about Russia breaking up?
Or how can we help?
Well, no, mostly, I mean, people were afraid of the chaos that it would unleash. And I used to say, I think the bigger problem is if Russia stays together, really, given its current foreign policy position. Or, J.D. Vance recently was saying, look, we're going to build this great trading relationship with Russia, and that's going to help, bring peace. Russia and Ukraine traded a lot before the war. Germany and Russia traded a lot before the war, and we know how that worked out. So, like, one thing we can do as analysts is point to some of the kind of flaws and arguments that people make, even if we're not great at providing solutions to like what should be done, but just pointing out to people, potentially problematic aspects of their arguments. So.
Yeah. I would agree with that, but I don't actually think that the war has so radically reshuffled ideology on foreign policy in this country that I mean I was able to spend 2 years in Washington working at a right-wing think tank which is not where I am as a human being, right, or as a citizen, but it worked if what you're doing is Russia, right? So and in some ways it was quite useful because it opened doors that otherwise if I was working as I wouldn't have been able to open. So I think that that to me is not the problem. I think the problem is actually that Russia expertise matters more now than it has at any point, certainly in my lifetime. And yet we are constitutionally as academics, sort of, we don't like uncertainty. We don't want to sound more certain than we are. We always want to caveat. We always want to give people margins of error, and that's right. But then what ends up happening is at the end of the day, the policymakers have to make decisions, right? And we're not very useful in that. It's always in that respect. And what they eventually want to do is just get us out of the room so that they can finally make their decision and move on. And if we're not helping them get to some degree of certainty, right, then we're actually helping them make bad decisions. And then
identify
criticizing
the
them.
trade-offs, then make it apparent to them things they might not have seen.
Yes, yeah.
Even if it's not our neck
Yeah.
on the line, if they choose A rather than B. So,
Yes.
sorry.
No, that's absolutely right. I don't think it's just gotten there's more to talk about, and it matters more. And I think that means it's harder analytically, but I don't think it's harder politically. Yeah.
Nina, you're in the rough and tumble world of commentary
Tumble.
almost all the time, commenting on
Fine.
Alaska, Trump, Putin, these
Trump,
kinds of things.
Well, from a kind of bullshit perspective, which is actually what they are. I actually find it much harder to comment in the last 15 years because I think that analysis is not required. I think it's a point of view and the right point of view to whoever you talk to is required. For example, very difficult to explain why Putin doesn't want to meet with Zelensky, how Putin he's a coward and so on. And when I try to explain the formulas, just nobody is receiving that. So I find it very difficult, but also I have something that kind of a view that I'm sure others don't share and I don't insist on it, I just have it. I don't think that America had policy in the last 15 years in Russia. A lot of it was politics. A lot of it was screaming of what our perceptions of and what we think of Putin. I think you, Sam, pointed it out too. When Russia says something, it may be wrong, but it needs to be considered. But who would consider Russia? Although Maria says that the Cold War wasn't over. I thought it was semantics. Maybe it wasn't over as a confrontation, and certainly that Cold War was over. So I hope we will get back to expertise, but given to where we are going with a brave new world, I don't think we can recover from Trump. I mean, I think the next thing is a TikTok president or something. But as somebody who teaches media and propaganda, I don't have a I have a very dim view of humanity and its future.
Right, get the last word.
So, yeah, unlike many scholars here who can compare what was before the last 10 years, I only started commenting within the last 10 years. My first Vedomosti article was actually 2013, and this is where I started my public career. But I will say, from my experience over the last 10 years, it comes and goes. I would echo a lot what Tim especially mentioned, being in DC, trying to brief policymakers all the time. Sometimes, so far the great news about Russia and Ukraine, that the war, it's horrible news. The war has been so obviously atrocious, unilateral, unprecedented, and not well motivated on the Russian side, that the bipartisan consensus largely held. It's been held on Russia especially. However, there are moments definitely like the Russiagate, which was brought up, or more recently Ukraine issue that was associated to impeachment. And then in 2024, when the Ukrainian ambassador made the mistake, I think it was essentially being associated more with the Democratic side, when the issue becomes slightly more partisan all of a sudden, and there's a danger that the of the bipartisan consensus will be lost. But so far, and this is what I admire about the American system, is that unlike the Russian system that I study, it actually has shown a lot of elements of self-correction over time. And so far, we've been able to hold, at least on the Russia matter in particular, somewhat this dynamic. We'll see where this is going with this administration, but we see the welcome and development that Trump's rhetoric on Putin has been toughening at least, and he keeps promising sanctions, and we're still waiting. So in that sense, I think that this just because the nature of the Russian threat is perceived more or less similarly among the American establishment and clearly clashes with the long-term American interest, the way it's perceived by the American establishment, and there is bipartisan consensus on it somewhat. I remain hopeful, even if over the last months the challenge has been really to find somebody to brief. So we have the expertise, but sometimes it's challenging to find them somebody, the target person to communicate this expertise to. Last but not the least, just in my own example, for those aspiring Russia experts going forward, like when I started at Columbia, I actually wrote my dissertation on Central Europe and liberalism because I thought, gosh, who's going to care about Russia? It was so like uninteresting back in 2013, I thought, and that's just another example how political scientists always fail at forecasting. So learn from my mistakes and study some Russia because apparently it's going to be useful going forward.
Thank you. That's a great place to end. I think, Josh, you take us in?
Yeah, I just wanted to please join me in thanking our panelists for their. And I do want to say at a moment where, you know, engagement is tough, you know, there was engagement here and people were brought up, and I thank you, the audience, for asking tough questions. I think the panelists for taking those questions seriously and for people questioning each other what they're thinking here. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming out today. It's almost 7 o'clock right now, for giving us 2 hours of your life. This has been amazing. I want to thank Alex. I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation. I thank our viewers on Zoom as well. It's been just a real pleasure being involved with this series. I have learned so much from all of our panelists, all the panels that we've had, and today was absolutely no exception. So thank you all. Thanks for being here. We have loads of great events coming up at the Jordan Center, even without the New York City Russia Public Policy Series, sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation, and keep an eye out for a reborn New York City Russia Public Policy Series sometime coming to you in the near future. So anyway, thank you all so much, and thank you guys.